Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Once again, it's Access to Democracy, and you've already been tipped off to who our guest is, and he's actually president and CEO of Key Investment.
That's right.
To complete what you just saw on the board. But it's amazing to me that in the 12 years plus that we've been on, Vance has not been a guest here. So Vance Opperman, welcome to Access to Democracy.
Thank you.
Vance has an incredible career and background. First place, he is a member of more boards than Lumber Liquidators sells. So he's a former president of West Publishing. He is on the board of the Thomson Corporation. Right. He's on the board of Avnet Web Solutions, Blue Cross,
Twin City Federal,
Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine,
True.
TCF Financial,
Yep.
Key Investment, of course, as we mentioned, and he has just been elected chairman of the board of directors, or president of the board of directors of the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union.
I have.
Very involved financially, as a benefactor, very involved in the community, very involved in civic issues, and it's really a pleasure to have you here for the first time.
Yeah, thank you. Look forward to it.
We go back a ways.
We do.
And when Vance first became president of West, he used to come to New York when I was associated with them and make fun of me at at banquets and things like that, but always the foil. So let's talk about, you just became president of the board at the Civil Liberties Union.
I did.
Some of the things that the Civil Liberties Union does, and we've had Chuck Samuelson in
good,
here, and we've had Teresa Nelson in
Right.
here, and in fact, Chuck has been a multiple guest. And but why did you get involved? And I know why you got involved, but tell us why you got involved with the Civil Liberties.
You know, the moment where I got re-involved, I had been involved in the Civil Liberties Union in law school when Lyndon Johnson and the Johnson-Humphrey administration were illegally wiretapping American citizens. And many of us in law school at the time were involved in the anti-war movement, and so we all joined the Civil Liberties Union really for that reason. Many of us continued, occasionally we do volunteer cases over the next 30 years. And then one day I was reading in the New York Times, and then later the Wall Street Journal in 2005, where they revealed that the Bush administration was doing what the Johnson administration had been doing, and that's wiretapping American citizens and engaging in other illegal surveillance. Some of them involving phone companies, others involving banks, and without, by the way, statutory justification. So I called up. I didn't know who the chair of the Civil Liberties Union locally was at the time. I called and said I'd like to be re-involved. It seemed to me a kind of a ring composition. I've seen this picture before, and so I got involved. I got elected to the board, and in the fullness of time, I was chosen and elected to a 2-year term as the new president of our board, which just happened last month. So in part, that's the personal reason. But the Bill of Rights really can't protect itself. And when you
And
have...
the Bill of Rights has been under attack. I mean, let's face it, and it still is.
time.
Even under this administration, it has
yes.
not moved nearly to the left as much as I would have liked. And of course, when I was practicing, I did law, volunteer lawyer work for the Civil Liberties Union. I should mention that you were the managing director of a firm, and
Yes.
I know that you did also.
I did. And I would put it a little differently, Alan. I don't see it, actually, what amazes me is the people that claim to be far right and very conservative, not all of them are active in the ACLU, and I would think they would be, and I'll tell you why. Regardless of left-right, the Bill of Rights was written to protect individuals against majorities in government. That's why it was written. That's its function, and that's what sets apart our country from almost any other country in any other form of government. So, for example, when the police and the marshals kick your door down claiming to have a warrant, and they steal your business records, your children's books, your business cards, somebody has to redress that. That took place in the 60s. It took place in 2008 in Minnesota, which is why we're in court on that very set of facts, to vindicate individuals' rights. I mean, after all, vast majorities don't really need a lot of people to protect their rights because they're the vast majority. And so,
Just last week, our Supreme Court justified a warrantless search
Yeah.
because officers were out to serve a warrant, not a search warrant,
Right.
but an arrest warrant, and they allegedly smelled marijuana. They kicked down the door and they found drugs in the establishment, and this Supreme Court, which is, to my way of thinking, the most far-right Supreme Court that we've ever had, or certainly in my lifetime, justified it by a 5-4 vote. And it's a terrible decision. I'm hoping that the Minnesota Supreme Court will do just the opposite when the case you're talking about comes before it.
well, they might. It kind of takes you back to the Terry v. Ohio days. You may recall, being a resident of New York at the time, that what would commonly happen is a police officer would get on the stand and they would testify, I thought there was a drug deal going on, and as I approached, one of the people dropped a bag of drugs at my feet. I picked it up, I looked at it, it looked like cannabis sativa L, and consequently I knew it was probably drugs, and I arrested the people, searched, and found the other instrumentality of crime. The New York Supreme Court, and ultimately upheld that. The Court of Appeals, when it was finally challenged in federal court, had a great opinion where they talked about this unusual fumble-fingered drug dealers in New York who, unlike any place else in the country, always drop their bag of drugs on the very shoe of the arresting police
Or
officer.
toss them out the window
Or
of the
toss them out
car,
the window,
right.
yeah. Yeah,
There's no question about it. And,
Look, their drugs can be a problem. There are plenty of ways to deal with drugs, and they ought to be dealt with. But what we have in this country, and what sets us apart, is a Constitution that protects the individual from the overweening power of the state. And it does not surprise me that the current administration has a very attackable record in many civil liberties areas. It doesn't surprise me because people, when they get great political and governmental power and they have other constituencies, it's very easy to give in to those temptations and to use those powers and not be particularly concerned about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, or in this case the Fourth Amendment. And that is why the Civil Liberties Union exists, and that's frankly why courts exist.
and of course, we have the right wing, as long as we
Sure.
are morphing into that discussion, talking about we want less government. Grover Nordquist wants to drown government in the bathtub. They want less involvement in our lives, except if it's a woman's life, they don't have any second thoughts about telling her how she can use her body. Or if you're gay,
Right.
and we saw it just in this legislature, and we'll talk about it some more, they have no second thoughts about telling you that you are not equal to anybody else when it comes to marriage. And they get involved in so many of these niche issues that it really, really deludes the Constitution, or really makes it a lesser really instrument, and it's very dangerous.
I share some. I agree with you. I find it kind of ironic that, you know, a lot of my friends on the left want to get involved too much in my boardroom, and a lot of my friends on the right want to get too involved in my bedroom. And we do have protections, particularly in the boardroom context, and equal protection and due process. There are many efforts. Well, I'll give you a very good example that we have fought in this state, and the MCLU has fought. For a long time, one of the kind of dirty little secrets, if police came upon a drug deal or an armed robbery, they could seize the instrumentalities of the crime, which would be guns, which could be legal, cars, trucks. Trials would be held or not. People would be let go, or they plea bargain, and they keep the instrumentalities, the cars, the guns, the stereos, and raffle them off. And the money was kept by, among other things, the gang strike force.
That's right.
This is theft of property without due process.
Which was a real scandal in this state only 2 years ago.
Right, and we've been fighting this for a long time at the ACLU, and there are two ways you fight that. One way is that occasionally, the problem is it's difficult for individual citizens to fight that in court because they can't afford a lawyer, and the process is pretty complicated. We would take some of those cases in court, but you can't take them all. The other thing that ACLU did, we started going to legislature and saying, come on, this is confiscation of people's property. All right, all left political parties ought to agree that you can't confiscate people's property without due process of law. If that sounds like the Constitution,
it sounds so fundamental
Right.
that we wouldn't question it. And yet, here's a 17-year-old who takes his mother's new car, and he has some marijuana, and he's arrested. They take the mother's car and sell the mother's car.
and keep the money.
And keep the money, right.
Without, by the way, without being subject even to legislative audit.
Talk about due process, talk about really rights
there's no
of
audit.
an individual. Yeah,
No
that's
accountability for the money, even though I don't think it should have. Well, we continue to go to court on those matters. We sought legislative redress, and Senator Miyamura pioneered an effort to change the law. She got most of it changed. There's a due process notice. They have to give you notice within 30 days. They have to get approved by the court, and the funds get audited by the legislative auditor, which takes away some of the incentive. We didn't get the whole thing adopted. We were opposed by certain interests, and we'll go back and try to get the rest of it repealed, or the rest of that practice prohibited. But that's a pretty good example of what the MCLU does in this state.
And we've talked with Chuck Samuelson,
Yeah,
who's the executive director, about people and their need to know that the Civil Liberties Union is there for everyone who has a problem, really, whose rights have been impinged, who have been really deprived of property, perhaps illegally by government, things like that. And certainly somebody like Rush Limbaugh, when he gets into trouble with drugs, turns up at the same organization that he has castigated for years, goes to the ACLU to defend him.
That's right.
And people have to understand, Nazis who are marching in Skokie have the ACLU defend their right, really, to march in public.
What do you remember the senator from Oregon who allegedly flew into the Minneapolis airport to engage in male consensual gay sex in a public bathroom, which allegedly was advertised in one of the online sites, and he had the misfortune of being in a stall next to a police officer who was there because people complained.
That's the Memorial Larry Craig stall.
That's right, right. And it was interesting, by the way, the local media never picked up on the story. It was the story was broken by the Washington Post. But in any event, he thought he could plead guilty and pled guilty because he thought the thing would go away and nobody'd hear about it. And that worked for 2 months until the Washington Post got tipped off, published it, and then he wanted to attack the statute. We defended him on that. We took the position that the statute, the ordinance actually, was overbroad. You could narrowly tailor criminal ordinances to prohibit unwanted sexual advances in bathrooms. But that's not what this did. What this did was, the language of this ordinance prohibited people from making requests and overtures between adults. And the problem with that is that if you really apply that, it probably would shut down every bar after 9 o'clock at night. I mean, adults can ask whatever they want of other adults. And so it was wildly unpopular. In fact,
You
it
have
was
your
unpopular.
First Amendment that
Right.
rears its ugly head.
Right.
Except it's not an ugly head, it's really a treasured head.
A lot of people were unhappy that we were helping to defend Senator Craig. We were ultimately unsuccessful on the ground that the court would not reopen his guilty plea, that he was a lawyer, that he was well represented, that he pled guilty, and that was the end of it, and the finality of judgment. And so we were not ultimately successful on his behalf.
Well, they took the narrow issue, which
They
is
did.
what the U.S. Supreme Court will do
Sure.
often, and not necessarily under the Roberts Court, where they will step beyond what's in front of them to create new law. See also Citizens United or any of those cases, and a very dangerous case in my estimation.
You know, the ACLU is quite split on Citizens United. I happen probably to differ with you on it, but the point you were making is certainly true, and that is that the court, which has generally preached a doctrine of non-judicial activism, which means, of course, to decide cases on the narrowest ground in front of you that will allow you to resolve the dispute. Instead, in the Citizens United case, the issue was not in front of the court, and they reached, rather than go back and develop a record and go back and develop a court of appeals, which would be the normal way that many cases get up to the court, they decided to reach immediately into the statute and declare large sections of it unconstitutional. I'll be frank and tell you, and there's a split of authority and there's a split within the ACLU. I think that is the right result for the wrong reason. I don't read, this is not the ACLU position which has been silent on this. My copy of the First Amendment does not have exceptions in it. It doesn't have exceptions for ACLU Inc. or Planned Parenthood Inc. or Citizens to Protect the Unborn Inc. or any other Inc. for that matter, or partnerships. But the point about judicial activism, it's remarkable the degree of judicial activism we've had lately.
And it's a strange thing to me that the right wing, when they are campaigning for office, will scream, "We don't want activist judges.
Yeah.
We don't want them in the state. We don't." In fact, in this state, the courts have moved to the right somewhat also.
Mm-hmm.
But what they really, really back is the Roberts Court, which has been the most activist Supreme Court in my memory, and certainly in my lifetime.
Well,
I
you know,
think.
some people think that's a good thing. I have friends on the left. The right is a little more cosmetic, who want an activist court, and they would regard the court that in the 30s that basically upheld the New Deal after the Curtis Wright decision as being good activism, and they would espouse the view that the Constitution is an organic living document, and therefore you need organic living people to change it as time goes on. You can argue that, and there are conservatives, particularly religious fundamentalists, who would argue that. I'm actually more of a conservative in that regard. I want the Constitution to be interpreted the way it was written. I don't think that usually calls for judicial activism, but there are times when legislation does not fit the constitutional framework. And in those times, then of course the statute ought to fail.
But those times generally are very small compared
Yes.
to the issues
They
that
are.
confront the court.
They are. They
And
are.
traditionally, I
They
mean, I certainly
I agree.
Was one who was in favor of the Warren Court, and that certainly was an activist court, but philosophically more attuned to my way of thinking. But the Constitution, you're absolutely right, is a fluid document.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have this fight with the NRA over weapons today if in fact everybody was restricted to having muskets in their home. And
You know, the ACLU is, at the national level, is split even on the Second Amendment the cases for years.
well, I am too.
I'm on the one hand, I'm not an NRA member, and I'm not carrying or concealing or any of that, and I fish a lot. I'm not a hunter. On the other hand, the Second Amendment uses the same absolute language the First Amendment does, and I give it real pause to that. However, you don't have the situation 200 years ago where someone would say, oh, overweening government, not only do I have my musket, but I have my plutonium in my basement. And if you don't like that, go back and check the botulism I got brewing in my kitchen. So there has to be some line that's drawn there, and you can call it living constitution, you can call it common sense, you can call it not making the Constitution not a suicide pact. I mean, there's a variety of ways to reach the point that there is some limit. And I actually thought the Supreme Court in the Washington, D.C. permit case started to grope toward that limit. However, I do read the Second Amendment in a much more absolute sense than many members.
And
of
I
the
have no
ACLU.
problem with people who have rifles and who are hunters.
Sure.
I don't think that they need a 30-clip AK-47 to do hunting, and I wouldn't want to pick 30 shells out of a deer's carcass. I have no problem with people having weapons in their home. I have pistols in my home, but I do think, for instance, that the Minnesota legislature overstepped its bounds when they just relaxed the shoot first law, or they just enacted the shoot first law, which I can only see as leading to disaster. There was a case of a young student a couple of years ago who knocked on somebody's porch, and the person got frightened and opened the door and shot and killed the student. Under this law that's now, well, it's before the governor, so it
Right.
really hasn't been signed yet, and I hope it won't be, but that could have been something that would be permitted. I think that relaxation is beyond what is necessary for people's protection.
Well, it's not required by the Second Amendment, and I'm not an expert in law enforcement. I'm certainly not an expert in firearms, but I was persuaded when the police association, when the chief of police association, when the Association of County Prosecutors, when the Police and Benevolent Association executive director all testified, including the chief from Hibbing, all testified that this is a great danger to police enforcement. It is a great danger to the people we protect. It is not a very good idea, and it will lead to mayhem and unfortunate tragedy. That would, had I been in legislature, that would have been enough for me.
It's unfortunate, however, that we have some young ideologues, probably more attuned with the Tea Party philosophy than what I consider to be the good and welfare of the state, who carry this thing to the lunatic fringe.
You know, Alan, when the Tea Party thing first happened, as kind of a committed civil libertarian, some of the people were clearly nuts, and you take a look at the audiences, and they are kind of monochromatic. But I gave that kind of a pass. For example, one of the things they said they would do was, in fealty to the Constitution, which kind of makes my heartstrings sing, is they were going to read the Constitution when Congress started. And so I thought, well, that's a little bit cosmetic, but I'm all in favor of reading the Constitution.
Probably be the first time a lot of legislatures read the
Yeah,
Constitution.
and that was my thought. What a great idea. By the way, we do at the State Fair, and we give away about 40,000 copies
Yes.
of the Constitution every year. And if you go to our website, which you can find by ACLU-Minnesota in any browser, we'll send you a copy of the Constitution, which includes Minnesota too. So I thought that was a great thing. So I watched it. Imagine my surprise when they didn't actually read the Constitution. They left out parts of it. They left out because they were saying, well, we believe every word, it must be applied literally, you cannot change, it's not a living, breathing document. Okay, so I found it interesting they left out the part about women can't vote and free landholders have to have the right, and they left out the African Americans being counted as 3/5. I mean, they left out the fugitive slave part. They left out large portions of the Constitution, which led me to believe that they don't think you read every word. They think it's a living document. They think the document is changed. I'm not talking about parts that have been repealed. I'm talking about parts in the Constitution. I thought it would have been an interesting historical lesson had they actually read the Constitution instead of just
Taking
parts.
a hypocritic type of approach to the Constitution, really.
Yeah,
And I'll take what I like,
right.
and I'll leave out what I don't like,
Right.
and that's the way it's going to work for me,
Yeah.
which is not the way it was intended to
Right,
work,
right.
period.
Yeah, as evidence that nothing ever has to change, because those parts they have to change, we leave out. Kind of like what the legislature did when they invited a minister that they knew well, by the way. I mean,
Just, yeah, in fact,
Reverend
I
Dean
just
has
wrote
traveled.
about that.
Did you? Well, Reverend Dean has traveled, Michelle Bachmann, he knows
Bradley
Zellers.
Dean, and she's raising money for Bradley
Right,
Dean,
right.
and his views
Right.
in many areas, anti-black, anti-Jew, anti-everything, are
right.
well known, and
Right.
also Tom Emmer came under
Oh, yes.
criticism last summer when he associated himself with Dean. So
That's
when
right.
he was asked to speak before the legislature, it was incredible to me that nobody did anything about it
Well,
until
and
after the fact.
They could have gone on his website and discovered much of that. And by the way, you know, he has an absolute right to have those views, an absolute right to say those things. And we'd, by the way, defend that if he was ever denied. But that isn't the same thing as being invited to open the legislature. And as a matter of fact, I just wrote our executive director and said, I find it a little offensive, as have other members from time to time, Terry Bonniff being one, that this group in particular, but there have been groups in the past, and they've been in both parties, who have always wanted to invoke their particular religious view or their particular religious cult and giving it the imprimatur of some kind of official approval by having it open a legislative session. Legislative sessions are not opened by religious oaths. Our Constitution prohibits the use of oath of any kind for any state or
If you
federal
look
office.
back at last Friday's Star Tribune, there's a small blurb by me to that effect.
I
So,
was out of town, I didn't see it.
and,
Oh, well, good for you.
And I said, why is it necessary
Yeah.
to have any invocation, really? Certainly, the separation of church and state would indicate that religion has no place, although we have placed it in many instances in front of our legislative bodies.
Right.
I still think it has no place there.
I agree. It's a terrible mistake. It's a terrible mistake for those people who are deeply religious for a variety of reasons. If you start having a religious or sectarian or a cult get control of the federal or state purse or the emoluments of officialdom, they'll start making demands on those who don't agree with them. They'll ask for their money. They'll ask for their adherence.
And they do that.
They do, yeah, I know.
They do that right now. They do it with abortion, which is a prime example.
Yes, it is. But I'll give you a good example. There have been a number of cases. The U.S. Supreme Court did not take judicial activism on the question of In God We Trust, which was added to our money and coin 180 years after the country was founded. And the argument was that it's not religious. The people that defend that phrase say, well, it's not religious, which kind of demeans their religion, I think, but that's up to them. It is not religious, and therefore it's historical, and therefore it can be used.
And where does that leave the atheists?
Well,
And
where does
the agnostics?
Sure. 25% of the population apparently nowhere. But let me turn that around. The problem with having those kinds of religious imposition on everyone else, whether or not you agree with them, the problem is the worm turns. And for those who find it not offensive to say, in God we trust on the money, forgetting, of course, Isaiah and Matthew, a rich man can't get into heaven. It's easier for a rich man to go through, or a person to go through an eye of a needle. Or forgetting the fact that mammon and religion probably ought to be separated. But laying all that aside, what if instead a group got control of a committee or a city or a state, and they wanted to amend their official bonds or currency to say, in Allah we trust? Do you think then
Absolutely.
people might say, oh, wait a minute? And that's the point.
Look at the pushback we've had against Muslims in this country since 9/11.
Yeah.
Like everyone else, there are a few bad apples,
Mm-hmm.
but this is a huge population, which is basically a peaceful population. I've had an imam in here
Mm-hmm.
recently where we had a really good dialogue about that, and Keith Ellison is in here frequently.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just take and segregate a certain portion, and you can't really take your government unless it's going to become a theocracy.
Right. Well, I think theocracies tend to be, fairly dumb and fairly stupid and not do very well, to be frank. And that's why America has done so well. And we're smarter than that. I mean, if for example, take your hypothetical, if the consensus were, or if the common culture somehow affected our police and justice system, that there's something suspicious about all Muslims, the reason that is stupid is because then, and there will be Muslims who are terrorists. There will be non-Muslims who are terrorists. The Unabomber comes to mind. If we spend all of our time and our limited resources and our limited police resources on all Muslims, we're going to miss one heck of a lot of people that we ought to be paying attention to. I think Americans, like anybody, fear can stampede you into doing things. I think 9/11 had that effect.
The Patriot Act, I think.
Yes, the
is
Patriot Act, good example.
And a good example
Yeah.
of what fear does
Yeah.
to really take away people's rights. And it's not the first time we've done that.
No.
In World War II,
Japanese
we
detention.
took our Japanese population and we
Yeah.
put them in what is in effect concentration camps,
Yep.
although we didn't execute them. But ultimately, some of those young Japanese who joined the army became our fiercest fighters
They did
in Europe.
in Europe.
And, well, how can that be? They're the enemy. Well, they weren't the enemy. They were Americans. And that's what people don't understand.
That's right.
And,
I think a lot of people do understand that.
I hope they do.
There's the heat of the moment. It was shocking to be attacked in 9/11. People flew flags that had not flown them before. I think that's an understandable reaction, but I think what's really, first of all, we have a constitution and we have a tradition, and it's ingrained in Americans. I'll tell you why. You take an American, really any of them, anybody in this country, and you stick them in any foreign country really, where they're told you can't say these things, or it's against the law to print these things, or you got to be very careful who you criticize because there are laws against it. You can't, for example, in England, leak the Queen's message before Christmas. And when the London Times did that in 2002, they were fined. I think any American say, what? What do you mean I can't say what I want to say and I can't criticize what I want to criticize, and I don't care if they're the Queen or the King or whatever. That's part of what comes in a constitutional framework where you have the Bill of Rights, and we
And
have our
it's
system.
part of what
government.
makes us different from
Yes.
almost every other country.
It is.
And why people from all over the world want to come to America. They want to emigrate to America. They
Well,
want to become part of our culture. And that's what we were built on.
it's all Alan. It's also terrific business. I mean, you take a look at what America exports. In any other country, if they pan a crowd of demonstrators in, pick a country, Afghanistan, you will see somebody in a T-shirt that will say Nike. It'll say Disney. It'll say Longhorns. Intellectual property, copyrights, trademarks, patents, is dominated by exports from this country. Over 35% of all intellectual property comes to the United States. I mean, our population is about 5%.
The motion picture industry.
Motion picture,
the
movies,
music industry.
music,
No question.
software. I think that is the kind of commerce and the kind of creativity that you get when people are encouraged, and it's part of the culture to speak out, not to be afraid, to have the view that freedom of expression in all matters at all times has to be tolerated and has to be protected, so that you have a whole culture of people over many generations now that are strong believers in intellectual property creation and the protection of that. Many other countries don't have that. So I also think it's great business.
Let's get closer to home. Our legislature just concluded at midnight last night without a budget.
Yeah.
They had time to pass some bizarre legislation, which is sitting on the governor's desk now as we sit here, which probably is going to be vetoed. They were in session for 4 months. They gave him what purports to be a budget about 4 days before the conclusion of the session. He offered to compromise with them. Obviously, we have debt in this state, which I was pleased to see Governor Pawlenty yesterday say that he balanced the budget every year, but he didn't mention that he left with a $5.8 billion deficit,
Right.
that property taxes went up, that school levies were imposed, that people were in a lesser condition. But our legislature carried that same mantra: no new taxes, no new taxes. They won't even compromise with the governor. What's going to happen here is we could have a shutdown on July 1st. Our industry in terms of tourism will be hit. Thousands of people will be losing their jobs. People won't come here. And tourism, which surprised me, along with agriculture, are our two biggest industries. It doesn't seem to bother these people philosophically at all that the culture is going to suffer, that monetarily we're going to suffer, that people are going to lose their jobs. It doesn't seem to bother them that there are thousands of people without health insurance, where other states are finding solutions, and they would cut people off. I can't get my head around the mentality of some of these people in office.
Again, we're going to be mostly in agreement. Let me make this point. Many of the things that we're discussing right now are not ACLU kind of issues. Some of them are. But for example, there are always very strong differences between the legislative branch of government and the executive branch of government, even when they're in the same party. And where the rubber meets the road is always the budget. These people are elected and re-elected to get a budget done and to work out the compromises and keep it going, whatever it takes. And so we do not have an interruption of service, so we do not have interest rates that go up because people are worried about us defaulting and all the rest. And in the past, we've had some government shutdowns. They typically have been very short, but very few of them in the history of our country. Actually, not until 2005, I think.
Under
was
Pawlenty.
was the first one. We got through the Civil War and World War I and II without one, and Korean War, Vietnam War, but under Pawlenty we had one in 2005. But at the very least, look, budgets are matters of numbers. Ultimately, you cannot have a budget discussion until you can agree on what numbers you're going to use. You may disagree. I want more of these numbers. You want fewer of those numbers. Okay, but at some point, because you're predicting the future, how much revenue there's going to be and how much things are going to cost, you have to have an agreed upon source of those numbers so your discussion can have some kind of compromise and reach some kind of fruition. And always until this year, we have had a budget office that is nonpartisan and is the agreed upon source of the numbers. In fact,
Until this year.
until this year, and Dayton did something quite spectacular, I thought. He left as the commissioner the person that Pawlenty had. So the numbers come out. The Republican proposal from the House is fanciful. That's what they called it. The numbers were about $1.8 billion short. Now, you can't pass, first, constitutionally in this state, your budget has to be in balance. But even if you were able to fool everyone and have it be $1.8 billion short, when that became evident about 16 months from now, you would then have to have an emergency session, or things would stop immediately.
Or you can use tricks such as the Pawlenty administration did. Well, we owe money to schools and
Shift
they
it.
have to run, but we'll shift it over to the state.
Right.
Or
Or
several
shift it in the next
gimmicks.
biennium.
Right.
Yeah.
Gimmicks like that they use several times, which is just completely deceptive because you're creating the deficit or enlarging the deficit and not
For the
being,
next guy.
not being truthful. Right.
Well, the other trick that Pawlenty used and cannot be used now is to raid all the trust funds. So I thought when he took the $1.2 billion out of the tobacco trust fund, he should have at least thanked Mike Cerisi and Humphrey for setting that money up so he could take it.
Mike was in here recently
Was
and
he?
and we
Did he make
talked
that point?
about that, yes.
Well, someone should have said, "Thank you, Mike." I mean, just a brief thank you. But you can't take it. Once you take it, it's not there anymore. You can't take it again. But the point is that now you have a situation where the radical group, particularly in the House, has rejected what has been the unbroken use in this state of an agreed upon source, and in this case, nonpartisan source of the numbers. So they make up their own. When you get into a situation where people can make up their own facts, you really can't have an agreement, ever, because I'll make up the facts I like, and you'll make up the facts you like, and there's no reality test. I find that very, very disturbing. To be honest with you, the budget issue is not that difficult. You can see where the compromise ought to be. It's a very uncomfortable set of choices. I told Mark when he first told me he was going to run, "Why do you want this job?" I think the choices.
That's
are
funny.
very-
I asked him the same
What'd he
question
say?
here before the election.
What did he say?
He said, somebody has to do it and get us back on track.
Well, the choices, I wrote a column, I write a column in a business mag about this. These are unpleasant, uncomfortable, and to some people are going to bear really an unfair burden. That's true. But the easy outline of what should have been a compromise would be to say, all right, half cuts, half tax increases. There's a certain symmetry to 50-50. It isn't fair, but when you got kids, and they bring you cookies and somebody else wants, what do you do with them? You cut them in half, right? Or if they have a baby, for example, the Bible. But
Solomon doesn't enter into this.
right, that's right. They didn't really cut the baby in half anyway. But so you have 50% cuts, you have 50% tax increases. The 50% of the cuts will include a shift to the next biennium of the K through 12 1.2. I think that's going to happen regardless. I mean, even the DFL did that last time when it came back from the courts. And then you have the other half of tax increases. And the debate should have been, where do you make the cuts? You're going to have to. The question is, what do you cut that hurts the least?
And there are certain things that have been cut regularly,
Yep.
such as the MnSCU budget, which has undergone cuts for several years, and particularly the University of Minnesota
Yeah.
budget. And Speaker Zellers last week got on the floor and he talked about the 20 to 30% bonuses that were paid to MnSCU employees on top of whatever else they're making. And I, as a MnSCU employee, know that we've had a freeze on salaries for the last 3 years, and I emailed him and I said, you know, it would be nice when you make a statement if you did some research and you know what you're talking about, because these are the facts. Day before yesterday, I got an apology email from him saying you're absolutely right, and I corrected it on NPR, and I should not have said it without checking it out. And that surprised me quite a bit.
It is, although it's a common political trick, of course, to say one thing to a large audience and then apologize in private. And that's not no partisan group has a monopoly on that tactic. That's a way to silence your individual critics while keeping the large unwashed uninformed.
I think that's how the Tea Party had some great success
Yeah.
this last election.
Yeah, well, it's a continual fantasy. You cannot have a growth in entitlement programs so that everyone over the age of 65 is your next door millionaire, as the Wall Street Journal wrote last week, and you continue to cut all taxes, and at the same time you have world-class colleges, universities, and marvelous K through 12. The fact of the matter is we don't have any of that, and you're going to have less and less of
We
it.
did.
We
but
did.
We
We
don't
That's right.
any longer.
That's right. That's right.
And that's part of the problem that this country is facing.
Yeah.
And that's part of what people really have to recognize. And I wish that we could get people to understand this. I wish we could tear them away from their Facebooks and their Twitters and their LinkedIn and their reality shows and the things where they live in sound bites and don't take the time. And it doesn't cease, never ceases to amaze me as to how much history our students don't know and what
Well,
they
yeah, here's-
lose by not knowing the history of some of these things.
I can give you a very short piece of history. It's not that long ago. You may recall that when Al Gore attempted to discuss the problem far enough in the future, 11 years ago, in Social Security by having a lockbox, i.e. not allowing the government anymore to steal the money out of the so-called trust fund and include it in the general budget, which Lyndon Johnson, by the way, started to do. It was his little trick to make the Vietnam War look less expensive, the integrated federal budget. And when Al Gore came out and wanted to reverse that to protect Social Security, he was roundly criticized, satirized for having the lockbox. So we don't have, when you have a culture where your political leaders lie to you, and I use that word with some care. It's one thing to be misinformed and repeat the misinformation. You should have informed yourself, but you believe it to be true at the time. But when you know a set of facts is one thing, and you intentionally say the other, so that
Or you
people
take it out of context,
take it out of
which has
context.
happened
Yeah.
in our own legislature within
yes.
the last week on several occasions. That is deceptive.
It is.
And that is a violation, to me, of your oath of office.
I agree. And unfortunately, we have a lot of that. Look, the legislature, again, their job, it's in the state constitution, it's why we elect these people, is to work out a compromise, maybe spend less, maybe tax more, all of that gets compromised, which means no one gets exactly what they want, but the ship of state moves forward. That's why you have elections, and that's what they're there to do. And instead of doing that, what we got, besides discussions about stadia, what we got was the constitutional amendment to declare that a marriage is between one man and one woman. And I saw that, and I've watched some of the debate, and what problem legislators, when they're not doing budgets, which I think they should do first, because it is their major job.
I absolutely agree with you in that
What
regard.
problem is that meant to address? Well, let's see now. Gay marriage is a threat to marriage?
To who?
Yeah, to who?
To who?
And if we're in the business of suddenly not doing budgets, but instead let's root out all the real threats to marriage, real threats now. Well, I think divorce is probably more a threat to marriage.
Obviously, statistically, 50% of the marriages in this country end up in divorce.
Right. I think probably you could argue that just take a name, there's always one in the news. How about Arnold Schwarzenegger? Certainly a threat to that woman's marriage since she was married when he impregnated her. He was too, actually, not to her. But take your pick. There's always one in the paper. Mel Gibson, the senator from Louisiana that was using prostitute. I mean, those people, if the job here of our legislature is to ferret out and to punish and set aside and to stigmatize the threats to marriage, if that's what the state ought to be doing, then there are some real threats you ought to go after. Of course, they didn't do any of that.
Of course they didn't.
Of course not.
They attacked voter ID in this state, which probably has the best voting record in the country. We certainly turn out the most voters. We've had the least amount, a minuscule amount of voter fraud, and yet they're trying to make it more difficult for people to get to the polls.
That's right.
By having to have a voter ID, by not being able to register the day of elections. Thank you, Mary Kiffmeyer.
Right.
And I mean,
Even though
keeping people from the polls is not what we're about. Getting them to the polls is what we're about.
Well, I think, unfortunately, and you can argue partisanship, a lot of people, once they get elected, they run, government's terrible and it's awful, but they really want to stay part of government. They'll do anything to get reelected. And that's what these matters are about. And so they don't want people to go to the polls that aren't going to vote for them. And so my problem with the voter ID, we have not yet taken a position on, but I suspect our board will. Our problem with it is equal protection and the fact that you're denying the basic civil right of the right to vote. But here are the people that are going to be hurt. People that don't have driver's licenses. Who are those? Well, some people don't drive. Some are aged.
And the elderly, certainly.
Some are in nursing homes. Some have bad eyes. Some, I have an in-law. Some never learned to drive. Some are in rural communities.
Some are military people
Who's gonna get-
overseas
and-
whose licenses have expired.
Right.
They're putting their life on their line for the country.
And they can't vote.
And they can't vote.
Right. And they're going to have a hard time if they're in Iraq coming back here to get a special state-issued ID and then going back. Not sure that they'll let them do that. Students, people that have moved, you're a student, my next-door neighbor. You live in my neighborhood, but you're going to St. Cloud, or you're going to Duluth, or you're going to St. John's, and you live there. You have perhaps, maybe, a student ID, maybe, but it will be different than your driver's license, which may expire. All of those groups of folk, recent immigrants, people that have moved in the state in the last 30 days.
That's correct. That's what I was just going to bring up.
Yeah. None of those people will be able to vote, or they will find it very difficult to vote.
Workers who get jobs on the Iron Range
Right.
that are here temporarily, that want to vote, they're here for 6 months, they want to exercise their franchise, they can't.
That's right. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, let's call this what it is. The fact of the matter is, the people supporting this believe that those are primarily groups that vote Democratic.
No question
and that's
about it.
why they're Republicans. And so they want to have this partisan fight between Republicans who are desperate to hold on to office against some Democratic office holders that want to hold on to office too. But meanwhile, the rest of us, the Constitution, the right to vote, is being tugged in between, and for no purpose.
There are certain things. In today's New York Times, there was an editorial about Nassau County, which is, of course, where I lived and practiced for many years.
That's famous.
And redistricting. They took districts there and sliced them up beyond comprehension. I thought it was bad what was done here.
Yeah.
Redistricting should not be in the hands of the legislature. It should be in the hands of an impartial body that's going to not penalize one party or the other party, but is going to see that everybody is fairly represented. When Keith Ellison was in here just 2 weeks ago, I said, he's not my congressman, but he may be the way they're slicing
Yeah,
up the district,
yeah.
because there could be a long, thin line from Minneapolis to Egan. It becomes ludicrous. That's another way
Yes.
to exercise power improperly.
Well, the gerrymander, of course, has a historical, long historical precedent, called that way if you recall, because the one district looked like a salamander. Iowa has a much better system. You know, goes directly to a group appointed by the courts. Many people think that they have the choice, that they go into polls to elect a representative. What they don't realize is, in the redistricting process, the representatives pick their voters. And you can be sure that they pick them in such a way that they help their particular political viewpoint against somebody else's. And again, to the extent that the ACLU would get involved, it would be involved if there's a violation of equal protection in that process. And there very well could be. There very well could be. I get very concerned about when government doesn't work and when citizens can't solve community problems operating through government. Then your whole social fabric breaks down. And then what makes the country special and attractive to other people and other businesses
And
fails.
citizens have to understand that they can get involved,
Yes.
and they can make a difference.
Oh,
That's one
boy.
of the things. As I told you, we're close to 1,000 interviews on this show over
Wow.
12 years.
That's a lot. Wow.
And when Keith Ellison was in, he said, I want you to write a book about what you're doing here and how important it has been to bringing this information of all sides, and both sides, which have always been welcome here, to the people. And I said, I'll tell you what, if you'll write the foreword, I'm going to get to work on the book, which I have.
Good.
And it's entitled, You Can Make a Difference, whether it's in cable access, or whether it's getting involved in your community, or whether it's running for a commissionership, or whatever it is. You can. And if you care about your country, and if you care about your children, and if you care about the future, you must make a difference, and you must get involved.
Well, I obviously agree with that. You could also join the American Civil Liberties Union and help defend Bill of Rights, which I tell you, there's no lack of challenges, no lack of attacks. But I agree with you. Holding office, running local city council, local planning board, a lot of what affects the community goes on in planning commissions, and it goes on in planning commissions because nobody shows up and nobody has any idea what the planning commissions are doing. Except maybe a few developers in the audience. Citizen involvement and the sunshine of citizen involvement is a very, very good disinfectant. It truly is.
You know, it's been 12 years since we got you here, but it's not going to be 12 years before we get you back.
I look forward to it.
And we've been talking to Vance Opperman, one of the most involved of Minnesota citizens in so many respects, and a benefactor of so many organizations. It's really been a pleasure, and I thank you for taking the time out. I look forward to you coming back.
Alan, it's been
and
a lot of fun. Yeah, thank
It
you.
really has.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.